Okay, good afternoon everyone. We resume with our exposition of the Edel discussion of Kabbalistic theology, specifically in his article Mysticism, and the second part of the distinction between the theosophic mode and the ecstatic modes of mystical activity and experience. We've already spoken about the theosophic mode, sometimes also referred to as moderate mysticism. We come now to the ecstatic or intensive mode of mysticism, according to Moshe Edel, which is sometimes also called prophetic. I will give examples, I think, where it may be necessary, but I won't confine myself necessarily to what he has discussed in the article. So first of all, we ask the same kinds of questions regarding this mode of mystical experience and activity as we did regarding the first. That is to say, what does it call for, first of all? And the answer is study and practice of various mystical techniques that are designed to achieve for the aspiring mystic an ecstatic experience, that is to say, rather concretely, a vision of the divine. The accent here is on experience, and the object of the experience is variously going to be described as a seeing of the divine form, sometimes called the divine body, God's body, or an ascent to the palace of God, even to the room and the actual vision of the throne of God. And it involves a variety of processes, some of which are entirely consistent with ideas and practices taught in both scripture and in rabbinic literature, preeminently in the oral law recorded in the Talmud and its commentaries. But when we get to now the second question, what type of mysticism are we speaking about? The way it is characterized is non-gnomic. Notice the way this is put, non-gnomic, not specifically expressive of the mitzvah system associated with traditional Judaism, but often involving activities or techniques which may be supportive of the mitzvot, but are more directly connected with preparing to achieve the kind of experience that is sought for. And these techniques and practices are not necessarily recognizable from what you all recognize as commandments in the Torah. So the goal here is to be achieved not through Torah study, as in theosophic mysticism, but instead by mastering these techniques. Well, what are they all about? They are concerned in part with breathing, exercises in breathing, fast and slow, long breaths, short breaths, and so forth. They are also concerned with letter combination, which is to say envisioning various letters of the Hebrew alphabet, or actually writing them on parchment, in combinations that are both familiar and unfamiliar, but generally meant to express either technical, mystical names of God, or to give deeper dimensions to more familiar names of God. A third activity is the actual pronunciation of God's name, and not simply El or Adonai, but longer phrases that might include Misha Amar V'Haya Olam, variations on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and other epithets and so forth, that themselves may be combined in certain ways so as to move your thoughts in particular directions, to give them a focus, so to speak, and in doing so to lay the groundwork, the preparations for experiencing those aspects of God, and more specifically those sefirot that are associated with the formulas that are used. One will also chant hymns, so there's a musical dimension to this, not necessarily accompanied by instruments, but nonetheless, it involves singing, and it basically introduces art into the realm of religious experience and specifically mystical experience. And finally, sitting postures and bending postures, one of which I specifically remember, at least being described, not being practiced, was sitting upon a chair whereby you lean forward and bend your shoulders downward as far as possible and have your head downward as far as possible. This will clearly affect breathing, constraining it somewhat. It will also, if done properly, cause blood to flow more rapidly towards the head. And it might actually generate various kinds of perceptions that are not typically normal as you're standing up straight. You may see stars, you may see variations of color, and the like. And this is in part deliberately designed to uproot one from normal, familiar experience in order to lay the groundwork for the mystical experience. So that is the answer to the second question. The third is, who engages in such an activity in pursuit of ecstatic or intensive mysticism? It is generally, in fact, as far as I know, there aren't exceptions to this. It is reserved for select candidates of a master. The master would presumably be a master in mysticism, who knows these techniques, who has practiced them successfully over a long period of time. The master may very well and probably could be expected to be very knowledgeable in classical works of scripture, halakha, and other matters, but this will not be crucial and directly drawn upon, in most cases, for achieving the kinds of experiences necessary. Rather, the activities that I mentioned before are necessary. Those select candidates can be great rabbis, as I indicated. One of the most famous of the tales, Agadic tales, that is meant to be historical, and may indeed be historical, we don't know for sure, is the one that is told about the four who entered Pardes. These are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. And you may recall that each one has a very different kind of experience. Pardes is not spelled out as to what it actually means. It is generally thought to be the mystical, or at least more intense, study of all things directly related to God and divine experience. It is not simply the study of Torah. And you may remember, it says of Ben Azai, Nichnas v'nifga. He enters, Heitzitz v'nifga, pardon me. It's assumed that he enters the Pardes, they all do. Heitzitz, he glances, and then he is wounded. He is harmed by this. We do not have an elaboration on what the nature of the harm is, but it could be some severe mental debility, either long-term or short-term. The case with regard to, pardon me, I'm mixing it up. Ben Azai glances and dies. Ben Zoma enters, glances, and is wounded, okay? But he continues living. Elisha ben Avuya heitzitz, v'katzatz banetiot. He cuts the plantings. This is variously interpreted, meaning either the roots of Judaism, or plantings has likewise been, and I think somewhat more plausibly interpreted, as the young shoots of future generations of students of halakha and agadah, and possibly also these exercises to enter the world of mystical experience, And by doing this, he is undermining their normal growth as Talmidei Chachamim. He is famous, of course, for having been deemed outside of Judaism altogether, and the famous novel by Milton Steinberg, As a Driven Leaf, tells the story of all four of these men based on elaborations of the Agadah. And who is it who enters and leaves? Presumably he glances. It doesn't say so explicitly. But Rabbi Akiva, nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. And he is the only one of whom that is reported. So he comes in unharmed and he leaves unharmed. And of course he becomes a great sage for generations to follow, although the rest of his life, as you know, is a heroic story that does enter into his being harmed by the Romans. He is the one who proclaims Bar Kokhba, the Mashiach. All right, what is it that the activity yields? One form of it is that what is apprehended is not simply the attributes and powers of God associated with the Sphirot, but the divine form engraved with the primordial Torah. So if this were to be illustrated, think of it in terms of not simply the Sphirotic system, which I've indicated to you in a previous discussion. I'll just bring it back to show you. Here we have Keter, Chochmah, Bina. These are the ones highest and closest to the Ein Sof. And then beneath, Chesed, Din, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut, the lower seven, are accessible to us. We can understand these. This is what the Theosophic tradition is concerned with. But if it's going to be a matter of apprehending the divine form, actually the second page of the handout captures it better. And that is something like this, possibly associated with the throne, possibly associated with entering the palace, okay? But here you again see the human form involved. There is also, interestingly enough, a notion here about the divine form engraved with the primordial Torah, which would presumably involve the stories of our ancestors from Adam all the way through Jacob, who becomes Israel, and the 12 sons and their spouses and children. And if the stories are involved, as well as the laws in all of their specificity, but this is engraved on the form of Adam Kadmon, what might it look like? Well, I don't know of a specific rendering of this in sources that I have managed to come across, but I have seen a rendering of something like this from a different genre altogether, but it's a quite interesting one. And that is from some works of science fiction. I have a favorite one, which I have read, by Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was a remarkably talented man who wrote science fiction from, I believe, the 40s, well into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and the like. He passed away just last year. I remember seeing him in Los Angeles riding his bicycle when I used to go to UCLA. He lived in the area, and he didn't drive, but he loved to ride his bicycle. I didn't know it was Ray Bradbury until somebody finally pointed it out to me. But look at the title of this work, The Illustrated Man. And it has a man, you see his back. He's apparently tattooed, but the tattoos are not simply lines. They are images from stories that are actually told within this collection of short stories of science fiction. In that regard, if we take something like this, as this illustrated man, as the equivalent of Adam Kadmon, then the stories of the Torah could conceivably be engraved on the form of that human figure, or man-like figure, and then told, just as a living person moving could, in a certain sense, give both change, dimension, and vitality to what is engraved, or in this case, tattooed upon his back. And it actually goes to his arms and presumably his legs as well. So here you have something from an entirely different genre of literature that nonetheless conveys the idea that is meant here. And this is not what one is typically familiar with in the study of traditional religious literature in Judaism. All right, what is the aim of the exercise? What is all of this supposed to produce? Well, it will bring the mystic to a state of intense mystical transformation. He, and it was basically he, not she, would see God if the exercises were successful in being performed properly, would be able to draw near to God, and in the most sought after, or at least successful kind of experience of intensity and intimacy with God, might possibly entail becoming one with God. The language associated with this is the drop of wine being reunited with the wine in the cup. The cup essentially being, I would think, the metaphor for the Ein Sof. There has been controversy, by the way, within scholarly literature about whether Judaism even has any notion of union with God. Gershom Scholem basically argued against it, but other disciples of his, and I'm at the moment not able to identify which of the figures I have in mind, but he is the editor of an anthology of readings from the Zohar, a 3-volume anthology. Yes, I just remembered, Isaiah Tishby. Isaiah Tishby was one of the first to argue very, very persuasively that there are examples of the aspiration towards mystical union that appear within Jewish mystical literature. And I think it's more accepted today than it used to be. And I seem to recall that there are cases where Edel and other teachers of Jewish mysticism have made the same case. In any event, that would be the most intense outcome. It does not happen often, but nonetheless, there are cases where it is claimed or certainly aspired to. This is obviously a transformation of not only the mystic's experience, it's a transformation of the mystic himself. But the goal is conformative. Remember, we used a similar language regarding theosophic mysticism, but reverse the application. I'll get to that in a moment. In this case, the mystic is transformed, quite obviously, but the goal is conformative in this sense. One wishes to be close and intimate with God, in effect, to be guided and, as it were, taken over by God, and therefore to conform entirely to what the divine wishes, longs for, and is able to accomplish. To become part of God in that sense is to become, ideally, God's agent, part of what contributes to God's strength. There is a remarkable example of this that is discussed in a wonderful lecture that was given by Yosef Dan, a disciple of Gershom Scholem's, who taught at Hebrew University for many years. He is now, I believe, retired. The lecture is entitled 3 Types of Ancient Jewish Mysticism, and it was actually given here in Cincinnati in the Judaic Studies program at UC in April of 1984. And in one passage of the lecture, within chapter 2 of what has been published under that title, he gives the following description, which I think you will find utterly fascinating. The description of the ascent of Rabbi Ishmael to the Hechalot. Rabbi Ishmael was the colleague of Rabbi Akiva. You may remember him. I'm trying to remember if it's the Sifra or the Sifrei of Rabbi Ishmael that is so famous. The other thing that's famous about him right now, I'm just blanking on which of the works is attributed to him. He is famous for the statement Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam. This was part of his ongoing argument with Akiva. Akiva would arrive at highly imaginative interpretations of statements made in the Torah, whereas Ishmael would say, the Torah speaks the language of ordinary human beings. It is meant to be understood by ordinary human beings and to convey its ideas in terms that would be immediately recognizable, not the kind of things that are entirely unrecognizable because they're so imaginative. Anyway, he goes on to say the following. The description of the ascent of Rabbi Ishmael, it's the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, that's what I was trying to recall. The description of the ascent of Rabbi Ishmael to the Hechalot, the palaces, okay, which is central, is a central theme of the Hechalot Rabbati, that is a collection of mystical reflections describing one's attempted ascent, his in particular, to the divine palaces, serves in the Sefer Hechalot as the opening two paragraphs. It is related, rather matter-of-factly, that Rabbi Ishmael ascended as he usually did, which is to suggest already that this is a familiar experience to him, even if it is very special. He's done it before. He ascended as he usually did, only this time he met Metatron. That's one of the famous angels, you may recall, who in answer to Rabbi Ishmael's questions revealed to him first his own biography and the story of his transformation, which suggests that the angel Metatron may have started out as a mystic. And then Metatron showed him Rabbi Ishmael, and told him all the secrets concerning the structure of the divine world, the forces within it, its treasuries, and its ways of operating. Every section of the work begins with the words Rabbi Ishmael said, Metatron, the prince of the countenance, told me. So he's really getting clued in on what takes place at this divine level by somebody who's there all the time now and who really knows. He goes on. Enoch was uplifted from among his pre-deluge contemporaries by the divine power called Anaphiel, who seems to have been a prototype of Metatron. You remember Enoch, that's Hanoch from the book of Genesis. He is the one who walks with God, but he also dies early, or so it would appear. He is apparently taken up to heaven, and he changes. Anyway, Anaphiel is the prototype of Metatron, and what follows from this narration? After overcoming the objection of the archangels to include Enoch amongst them, God gradually gave Enoch-Metatron divine powers of knowledge and a body, a garment, and a chariot of fire, which is to say that Enoch is indeed someone who is taken up into the divine world. He is a human being originally, and perhaps an aspiring human being to have an intimate experience of God, so he belongs to this intensive type. And God takes him up and turns him into, initially, a combination of Enoch and Metatron. But because of all of the other things given to him, a body, a garment, and a chariot of fire, what you can infer from this is that he becomes Metatron. Stage by stage, Enoch loses all his human attributes, grows enormous wings, has 100 eyes, and even acquires the divine name itself, the Tetragrammaton, with the addition of the lesser. In other words, we would put it as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh or Adonai HaKatan. That's the additional term that's given to him. It's not to confuse him with God Almighty. Such is his greatness that when Elisha ben Abuya ascended to the seventh palace, and this builds upon that famous Agadah we referred to, and observed Metatron sitting on a throne, and all the celestial powers worshiping him, he, Elisha ben Abuya, mistook him for a divine power equal to God, and concluded that there are two powers in heaven. And that was, of course, the great heretical offense of Elisha ben Abuya that led to his being designated as Katzatz Banitiot and considered outside of the sphere of Judaism. In order to prevent such a mistake from happening again, Anaphiel was sent a second time with a fiery whip to punish Metatron and prove who is the master and who is the slave. Well, it's not what I would call a happy outcome, but keep in mind that what is being described here is the utter transformation of a human being into a divine being, a god-like divine being. In Greek mythology and other Western mythologies, this is referred to as apotheosis. And that seems to be rather close to what is happening right here. So this is an illustration, you might consider it an extreme one, but nonetheless an interesting one, of precisely what is meant by the mystical mode called intensive or ecstatic. Ecstatic, by the way, means standing outside of oneself, from which we get, of course, the word ecstasy in its original meaning, having the special kind of experience that is so exciting, you are somehow not confined within your body any longer. You have gone beyond it. Now, who's the beneficiary of all of the preparatory exercises? And it's obvious, it's the mystic himself. And the last question is, what is the origin of this particular type of mysticism? And generally, it is associated with the priesthood, the priestly elite of the Second Temple period. Why? Remember, when the priest goes into the Holy of Holies, not only to express guilt and request repentance or initiate repentance for the sins of Israel, for the sins of the priesthood, and for his own sins, he also lights incense. Incense creates a cloud, and remember, God is behind the cloud or associated with the cloud that prevents one from seeing him. The cloud is always semi-permeable. That's one factor. Another is, and you may remember this, of course, from the reading on the High Holiday, specifically on Rosh Hashanah, of the Akedat Yitzchak story. There is an explicit reference to the site at which the Akedah takes place. It is Har HaMoriah, and there is an explication that is given of the name, Bihar Adonai Yira'eh, on the mountain of Adonai, he may be seen, he will be seen, or he can be seen. Who is he? God. And here is the experience, the more intimate experience of seeing God associated with what we later called the temple, that is the day after Genesis, and all of the activities that go there, or go on there. So that is the general identification of where this tradition begins. The Heichalot mystics seem to be the successors after the temple is destroyed. They are obviously Jews influenced by the rabbinic modes of leadership and teaching, which involves obviously halacha and agadah, but it also preserves this longing for an intimate experience with God, the kind of thing that has been spelled out now by Sholem himself. We've already gone over that, and has been developed here by Moshe Idel. By the way, those who aspire to this kind of experience are often called Yordei Merkava, Yordei from Yordim, those who go down to the chariot. The going down is problematic, because you would think the issue would be a matter of going up, olim la merkava. But it may be a reference to looking downward, or even going down to a body of water in which what is above is reflected safely below, and that becomes the starting point, probably, for the inner experience that will culminate in the soul rising above. Another rather famous name was associated with this is Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, a Spanish Jew born in 1240, who, if I remember this correctly, travels to Italy and elsewhere. And he even made prophetic claims under certain circumstances, and got in trouble with some authorities about this, and nonetheless continued to engage in this kind of mystical activity. There are sources that describe this, and if we have sufficient time, I will read you a number of examples from both his writing and likewise from the Zohar and other sources. Let's see how far we are time-wise, and we'll proceed from there. Now, to give two examples, one for the theosophic system and one for the ecstatic system or mode of mystical experience. Let me draw on one that is familiar to me simply from memory at this point, although some specifics I'll want to check here. Regarding the Zoharic teaching that is made or presented in connection with the observance of Sukkot, and specifically the Etrog and the Lulav, there is a principle which is invoked in the Zohar, which I want you to be familiar with, and then I'll give you the specification of how it applies in connection with the mitzvah of waving the Lulav and making the blessing together with the Etrog. The principle is this: all the mitzvot of the Torah are connected to the holy, supernal, or exalted king. Some to the head of the king, some to the body, some to the hands, some to his feet. This is taken from Zohar, Book 2, page 85b. And Book 2 would, I think, be Exodus. Now, just as the performance of a mitzvah is an act of building, constructing, so too their violation, that is to say, any act that violates a mitzvah, is an act of destruction and does harm in the divine world, just as an act of construction can do repair and bring about strengthening and better functioning of the flow of divine energy within the spirotic system of the divine world. Therefore, through his transgressions, a person blocks the sources and channels of divine energy and disrupts the flow of Shefa, both within the spirotic system, which is depicted here, much as you have it in the sheets that I distributed to you, and likewise flows from the top all the way through the system to the lowest level, which is the level closest to human beings and our experience. Notice that this is the realm of Malchut, divine sovereignty, and also, and here's the especially important indicator, Shekhinah. And from all of the rabbinic statements about the Shekhinah being the expressed or experienced aspect of God that can emerge and make itself felt even when two people or three people discuss words of Torah, in the experience of prayer in a congregation of 10, when a single judge does an act of justice in rendering his decisions and thereby brings God into the world as it is, with all of its faults and flaws, this is the kind of connection that actually affects us below as well as God on high. So that's the background. Now, how does this apply with the etrog and the lulav? Basically, the etrog corresponds to the lowest of the sfirot. So, I mean, in addition to the names Malchut and Shekhinah, while it's not named etrog necessarily, it has a kinship, a special relationship with this sfirah. When it is held, that brings the Shekhinah closer, as you might expect. What about the palm branch? The palm branch is associated with Yesod, which is the 9th sfirah. This is the 10th, that's the 9th, the one just above it. The aravot, the willow, there are 3 branches normally provided when you have a complete lulav. And the 3 branches apply to the, pardon me? Yes, apparently they apply to the 2 next sfirot here, Netzach and Hod. I was assuming they applied to the to 3, but it indicates to 2. And the hadassim, the myrtle. Oh, pardon me, I think I misunderstood. The 3 that I was reading, I have aravot as number 3. It was the 3rd I mentioned in the sequence. But there are 2 aravot, that is to say that there are 2 willow branches. So I apologize for that addition. And that's why they correspond to these 2 sfirot, Netzach and Hod, which are on opposite sides here. What then about the hadassim, the myrtle? Here you have 3 branches, and myrtle will take care of din or gevura on this side, which generally is associated with punishment, tiferet in the center, and chesed, divine mercy or kindness, on this side, leaving the only unaffected sfirot, or at least not explicitly affected sfirot, Bina, Chochma, and Keter, the ones that are furthest from the world of humanity, and the ones that are closest to the mysteries of the Ein Sof. When you bring all of these together, that is to say, the etrog and the lulav, comprises it is of a palm branch, back to Yesod, of the aravot, 2 aravot now, Netzach and Hod, and the hadassim, the 3 branches covering din, tiferet, and chesed, then what you have is a union in proper proportion, in accordance with a divine mitzvah, performed as it should be performed, and what that does is to restore the harmony that might otherwise have been compromised, damaged, disrupted in whatever way by human transgression, and thereby empower that divine energy to flow as it should flow. Okay? So that is a good illustration, I think, for how this system works in theosophic Kabbalah. And by the way, the identification of each of these sfirot with a particular ritual object or entity, which makes a unique ritual object, the lulav, and then for that matter also the etrog, is typical of theosophic mysticism. And what about the ecstatic example? I mentioned before Abraham Abulafia. He was indeed born in Spain. The city was Saragossa. That's in northeastern Spain. And the name itself, you may or may not know, is based on the name Caesar Augustus, Saragossa, Cesar Augusto. And what I want to read for you is a short description of the technique that he recommends, and then a short description of the kind of experience he is talking about. You can find this in a wonderful anthology composed by Louis Jacobs, appropriate enough for your theology course, and that is Jewish Mystical Testimonies. And and it has a wide selection of sources in translation, even including some medieval Jewish philosophers, Maimonides amongst them, who, insofar as he speaks of what appears to be like an experience of God, or at least an awareness of God's presence, regards it as mystical. I'm not so inclined to agree with him, but nonetheless, what he has to say about many others, I think is entirely on track. So here is what he has to say about the technique. Be prepared for thy God, O Israelite. Make thyself ready to direct thy heart to God alone. Cleanse the body and choose a lonely house where none shall hear thy voice. Sit there and in thy closet, and do not reveal the secret to any man. So this gives you a sense of the notion of selectivity. This is just for the elite. You don't go publicizing this. If thou canst, do it by day in the house, but it is best if thou completest it during the night. In the hour when thou preparest thyself to speak with the Creator, note, by the way, the intimacy that will have been achieved if you can do this, and thou wishest him to reveal his might to thee, then be careful to abstract all thy thought. To abstract here does not mean to make general and kind of difficult to apprehend. It means to draw away. Be careful to abstract, that is, draw away all of thy thought from the vanities of this world. Cover thyself with thy prayer shawl, put tefillin on thy head and hands, and thou mayest be filled with awe of the Shekhinah, which is near to thee. And that probably refers as much to the Sphirah as it does to the phenomenon of God's presence felt on certain occasions when religious actions are engaged in. Cleanse thy clothes, and if possible, let all thy garments be white, for all this is helpful in leading the heart towards the fear of God and the love of God. If it be night, kindle many lights until all be bright. Then take ink, pen, and table to thy hand, and remember that thou art about to serve God in the joy of the gladness of heart. Now begin to combine a few or many letters, to permute, that means to change them, and to combine them until thy heart be warm. So in other words, the exercise of letter combination is going to do something in warming you up and arousing feelings that will make the kind of ecstatic experience longed for possible. Then be mindful of their movements and of what thou canst bring forth by moving them. It may be that one will write these different letters on different pieces of paper, parchment that is, or even, for all we know, blocks of wood, and then move them around in different combinations, thereby producing words. Think of Scrabble in a sense, but it's much more serious than that. And when thou feelest that thy heart is already warm, and when thou seest that by combinations of letters thou canst grasp new things, which by human tradition or by thyself thou wouldst not be able to know, and when thou art thus prepared to receive the influx of divine power, which flows into thee, then turn all thy true thought to imagine his name and his exalted angels in thy heart. So here's an inward turn now. As if they were human beings sitting on or standing about thee. And that's where the diagram of the humanly represented structure of the Sphirot, what I called before Adam Kadmon, clearly comes into the picture. And feel thyself like an envoy, whom the king and his ministers are to send on a mission. And that is what the preparation is like. But what about the experience? I'll conclude with this. And all this will happen to thee after having flung away tablet and quill, so there's a time to put away all of that writing of letters and moving them about, or after they have dropped from thee because of the intensity of thy thought. And know, the stronger the intellectual influx within thee, the weaker will become thy outer and inward parts. In other words, the body is going to become weaker. One will be overcome. One will, in a certain sense, be transformed. Thy whole body will be seized by an extremely strong trembling, so thou wilt think that thou surely art about to die, because thy soul, overjoyed with its knowledge, will leave thy body. This is the notion of ecstasy, standing apart from, beyond oneself. Okay? And be thou ready at this moment consciously to choose death, and then thou shalt know that thou hast come far enough to receive the influx, the shefa, the overflow of divine energy. And then, wishing to honor the glorious name by serving it with the life of body and soul, veil thy face and be afraid to look at God, because the presence of God, the whole system, is going to be much more evident. And then what? Then return to the matters of the body. Rise and eat and drink a little, or refresh thyself with a pleasant odor, and restore thy spirit to its sheath until another time. And then rejoice at thy lot, and know that God loveth thee. There is the intimacy with God that is restored through this kind of activity. I think it illustrates the point very, very effectively. We'll stop there and continue with a bit more elaborate analysis of the Spirot and other aspects of mysticism generally, and then look at some texts from the Zohar.